My name is Eric Owens, and I'm the Associate Director of the Blasey Center for Religion and American Public Life. And our event this evening is co-sponsored, as you can see up here, by the Center for Human Rights and International. I want to thank Professor and Father David Hollenbach and Tim Kars at the Center for their support. I'd like to ask that you turn off the ringers from your cell phones before we get started tonight, but you don't have to put them away because we will be tweeting this event, and I hope that you might consider doing so as well. You see on the bottom right of the screen, the hashtag we're using for this is Casey Talk, and our own Blasey Center's Twitter account is at @Blasey_Center. And should you choose to engage our guest of honor this evening, his Twitter handle is @SpecialRepCasey. @SpecialRep. Follow him metaphorically and literally on Twitter, and I know he looks forward to getting a feel for listeners as well through Twitter. We are recording the event. Thank you to Front Row for doing that, and the recording will be available online as soon as they're able to process this. And as is our custom, our guest will speak for a bit, and then we'll have a lot of time for conversation and questions from the audience. So write down your questions, and we'll pass the microphone around after his talk. In early August of 2013, Secretary of State John Kerry announced the formation of a new office that would become the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, headed by our guest of honor tonight, Shaun Casey. Secretary Kerry spoke that day about the importance of religion in the lives of billions of people around the world, and thus in the affairs of every state and organization where these people live and work. Quote, "I say to my fellow State Department employees, all of them," Kerry said, "wherever you are, I want to reinforce a simple message. I want you to go out and engage religious leaders and faith-based communities in our day-to-day work. Build strong relationships with them and listen to their insights and understand the important contributions that they can make individually and that we can make together. You will have the support of this department in doing so, and you will have the great leadership of my friend Dr. Shaun Casey, who is going to lead the charge to integrate our engagement with faith communities with our diplomacy and our development work." Unquote. Later in that talk, Secretary Kerry said that he and Shaun became friends and pilgrims on a similar mission, if you will. A professor of theology who has always been interested in politics, that's Dr. Casey, and a politician who has had a lifelong interest in religion. I'm still quoting. In fact, John Kerry said, "If I went back to college today, I think I would major in comparative religion, because that's how integrated it is in everything we are working on and deciding and thinking about in life today." So I hasten to add that Boston College's theology department is waiting with open arms for all of you new comparative theology, comparative religions majors, and other departments on campus as well. Come join us for the comparative study of religion and international politics that you'll see in evidence with Professor Casey, Dr. Casey's work. But I'm digressing. Let me take a moment to introduce our speaker properly. Shaun Casey is the U.S. Special Representative for Religion and Global Affairs at the Department of State, where he leads a team of diplomats and scholars at the Office of Religion and Global Affairs. He is on leave of absence from Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C., where he was Professor of Christian Ethics and Director of the National Capital Seminar, as well as the role of religion in American presidential politics. The book, The Making of a Catholic President, Kennedy v. Nixon, 1960, was published by Oxford in January 2009. And he's at work, surely in all of his free time, on a couple other large-scale projects I know. One of them is editing the Oxford Handbook of Political Theology, to which I owe him a chapter. Don't ask for it. And the other is a book tentatively entitled Niebuhr's Children, about ethics and international relations. He's referencing, of course, the mid-20th century theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who was himself no stranger to religion and global affairs. Dr. Casey is a proud graduate of Abilene Christian University. He holds a master's in public administration from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, as well as a master in divinity and a doctorate in theology from Harvard Divinity School. It's such a pleasure to have an old friend and a distinguished colleague to join us today. Please join me in welcoming Shaun Casey.
Thank you very much, Eric, for that introduction. And it's great to see all of you on this night when I'm sure you have thousands of other more productive ways to invest your power. So thank you for coming out. Please do follow me on Twitter. I'm locked in a heated battle with a couple of my employees and right now I'm losing in terms of followers. So, you know, if nothing else, follow me, and I'll have some bragging rights when I go back to D.C. over against a couple of my suite mates. I'm a neophyte. I've been on Twitter now for about 3 or 4 weeks. So, but we're building an interesting following, and I would love to have you follow me and look forward to more interaction as we go. It is great to be with you. I've come previously to talk about this book I wrote. We did an event at Wazee Center back in 2009. And it's always great to come back to this campus. And so Eric, thank you, and David as well for your co-sponsorship of this conversation tonight. It's an honor for me to be here. When I come to Boston College, I think of 2 things. Most of all, and number one, he's my boss. Is a proud alumnus of Boston College, and he frequently reminds people of that. So if you have any questions about Secretary Kerry's loyalty to this institution, let me allay. In fact, I guess he spoke at commencement last year, I believe. And, there were hundreds of opportunities for him to speak in other places, and he chose BC. And secondly, I think of the Jesuit tradition, and I know that it's alive and well here, and I find it very impressive. As I was looking at the university's website before I came, I noticed the statement that Boston College is committed to maintaining and strengthening the Jesuit Catholic mission of the university, and especially its commitment to integrating intellectual, personal, ethical, and religious formation, and to uniting high academic achievement with service to others. As a theologian, ethicist, and now diplomat, that makes me feel very much at home. And so I'm proud to be here, and I'm proud to be associated with your deep Jesuit tradition. Now, I'm a low church Protestant. I grew up on the other end of the Christian spectrum in the United States. Now, this was a theological tradition so small and vexed, we had trouble organizing things as simple as one-car funerals. So I've long admired the ability of the intellectual and institutional resources of both the Jesuits and the Catholic Church. So it's always great to be here. My task tonight is to tell you the brief history of my work at this new office, the Office of Religion and Global Affairs in the U.S. State Department. And I think the proper place to begin that discussion is my relationship with Secretary of State Shaun Casey, and Eric alluded to some of his remarks back when I first joined the department. I came to Washington to teach 15 years ago after finishing my work at Harvard Divinity School in theology and in politics. So the land in the nation's capital was really a coup for me, given my research interest and sort of my historical interest in the intersection of religion and politics. But after the 2004 election, when Senator Kerry, in fact, was not a successful candidate, after that election, one of his senior campaign officials, who was a dear friend of mine, suggested that the two of us should meet, and he paved the way for me to meet then Senator Kerry. And we started what turned out to be about a 10-year personal conversation on a couple of issues of mutual interest. We started talking about religion in American presidential politics, because he had just come through that election in 2004. And part of our conversation was based on my then research about the 1960 presidential race. So in 2005, I was still in the midst of researching and writing that book. But very quickly, we pivoted to another topic that we were both interested in, and that was the intersection of religion and normative questions in American foreign policy. Out of his own experience here in law school at BC, he really then fast forward to the time he was sworn in as Secretary of State, and then very soon after that, he asked me to launch our Office of what we now call Religion and Global Affairs because of his passion that we need to do a better job in understanding religious actors and faith dynamics around the globe. And so I happily accepted that call. I finished out that semester and started in the summer of 2013. And I have been sort of riding a rocket ever since then. I want, in painting the background of the history of my office, to go, first of all, to something that happened in the White House in the summer of 2013. For about a year, there had been an interagency team working in the National Security Council on a national strategy about how our foreign policy should in fact interact with religious actors and faith communities. And so, recognizing the centrality of religion to our diplomacy and development objectives, the White House issued this national strategy, and it's a mouthful. I always have to look down to get it right. It was a national strategy on integrating religious leader and faith community engagement into U.S. foreign policy. And this strategy called for advancing U.S. foreign policy by engaging religious actors and institutions to do three things. Number one, promote sustainable development and more effective humanitarian assistance. Number two, advance pluralism and human rights, including the protection of religious freedom. And number three, to prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflict and contribute to local and regional stability and security. So what I want you to see is that in this administration in 2013, at the highest level, at the National Security Council at the White House, they thought very systematically and very carefully about how we should explicitly engage religious actors and faith communities as a part of our foreign policy. So as we say in Washington, D.C., we have great top cover. Literally, at the height of our administration, we have been told we need to do a better job of engaging religion in terms of our foreign policy. Then you fast forward to the end of February 2015, and Secretary Kerry issued what's called a policy guidance cable on religion and foreign policy. And that was an attempt to explain in more detailed fashion what we in the Department of State were doing with respect to this national strategy from the White House. So what I want to do for the next few moments is to tell you what is in this policy guidance cable that went out to over 200 embassies and missions in the U.S. Department of State around the world. And by giving you that background, you'll have a better understanding of what my office is doing on a regular basis. In the introduction of this cable that Secretary Kerry sent out, he offered some personal reflections. He said, in many ways ranging from the profound to the mundane, religion shapes the policy priorities of today. With 84% of people worldwide identifying with a religious group, religion remains a powerful and multivalent force in global politics and civil society, one that cannot be ignored. This year, the Pope played a historic role in opening Cuba. Faith-based humanitarian groups mobilized resources for refugees of Syria's brutal civil war, and activists evoked religious principles to call for action on climate change. At the same time, religion was used to justify violence with horrific results displayed on the streets of cities around the world. And on matters as diverse as how to stimulate economic growth, and on tamp down corruption, combat terrorism, contain violent extremism, deliver core social services, and promote public health, religion shaped the views of publics and change makers near and far. He went on to say these examples are but a few, but they're indicative of a larger truth. In every region of the world, and on nearly every issue central to U.S. foreign policy, religious institutions and actors are playing an influential role. He said, I am now calling for every post and bureau to strategically engage religious leaders in pursuit of these objectives and to regularly assess the role of religious dynamics in relevant policies and programming. So he then goes on to say that effectively executing these priorities has required adding capacity in recognizing our bureaucracy in a way that is, in reorganizing our bureaucracy in a way that is permanent and enduring. So he created the Office of Religion and Global Affairs, which was initially called the Office of Faith-Based Community Initiatives. And this office exists to add value and to amplify our already robust work addressing the role of religion in U.S. foreign policy. In addition to advising the Secretary on policy matters as they relate to religion, the office assists posts and bureaus in their efforts to assess religious dynamics and engage with religious actors, and also to serve as a first point of entry for religious actors that would like to engage the department in Washington, D.C. Now, I should hasten to add that we already had certain people in the State Department working on some religious issues, not the least of which was the Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, which was an office established by an act of Congress in 1998, and since then it publishes an annual report that assesses the state of international religious freedom on a global basis every year. And in addition, we also promulgate a list of countries of particular concern where there have been a high level of offenses against international religious freedom. That office is now in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and it continues to do its work. We are a peer organization, we're a partner organization, but we don't do the congressionally mandated international religious freedom work that office has now been doing for 17 years. Kerry went on to say that he was confident with the national strategy as a blueprint and our office as a guide, a source of skilled support. Bureaus and posts can now more strategically approach and assess religion's role in their diplomatic and development work. So what I'm trying to show to you is bureaucratically, we now have a national strategy from the White House, but the State Department itself has a policy guidance cable from the Secretary explaining why everybody in the State Department should take religion seriously. Secretary Kerry has only issued 4 of these policy guidance cables in his tenure. So this is a mechanism the Secretaries of State have to highlight priority issues, and they broadcast them out literally to every post and every bureau around the globe. So what then is our office about? What is the Office of Religion and Foreign Policy? What is our structure and what is our mission? We are a standing office within the S Bureau, as it's called. That's the Secretary's Bureau. And we serve 3 overarching goals or roles for the department. First, we advise the Secretary on policy matters as they relate to religion. And if you have even a nodding acquaintance with the headlines in the Boston Globe or the New York Times, many of the issues the Secretary deals with on a regular basis have a religious component or dynamic. And so we're very busy. So our advice covers a range of regional and functional priorities on issues as diverse as the counter ISIL efforts and climate change. We try to leverage our own knowledge and resources and engage a broad range of external experts to inform the Secretary Bureau's decision-making. Our second mission is to draw on expertise to increase post and bureau capacity to effectively achieve policy objectives by assessing religion dynamics and engaging religion actors. In this effort, we coordinate with the White House and the interagency process, both through a network of related offices and finally, a number of interagency policy committees. The good news is the State Department does a lot of religious engagement. The bad news is there's a lot more to be done. And so our office is an internal resource to try to make the entire complex bureaucracy be smarter and have better resources, understanding particularly the contextual impact of religion, given the diversity of impacts that faith traditions have, depending on where they are geographically. And finally, number 3, our role is to serve as an entry point for religious leaders and organizations that would like to engage with the State Department, ensuring that their voices are heard in the policy process and working with them to advance diplomatic goals. And in our first year, we met with hundreds of religious leaders, faith-based organizations, and religion scholars, trying to connect them with the appropriate posts in bureaus. Now, I should hasten to add, it's not that we own those relationships, but we help to facilitate them throughout the department. At one point, we finally decided to stop counting the number of organizations that came in because the number, frankly, was getting too large. I now just would say a lot of people that come to see us the second, the third, and the 4th time. And we have a series of robust relationships with them as we try to find ways to partner with them around the globe. Now, in the formation process of our office, we also consolidated a number of existing religion offices into one under the theory that there would be synergy in bringing us together rather than having them all dispersed to the different corners of the department. So to maximize that collaboration, we brought together the Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism, Ira Foreman, and also the Special Representative for Muslim Communities, Shard Zuffer, and this Acting Special Envoy to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, Arslan Suleiman. And they maintain their special mandates that they had previously before they came into our office, but we believe by housing us together, we have a synergy, multiplication of talent and resources because we are now in a core location in the Secretary's Bureau. Now, in addition to the work of posts and bureaus around the globe to help achieve these objectives, we offer out of our office a number of tools and resources that help people be more effective in this vast work of integrating religion into our diplomacy. The first resource we offer is simply the senior leadership, the 4 of us I just mentioned. We have, between the 4 of us, a pretty fulsome array of experience globally. So between us, we have traveled and we have met with senior religious leaders and government officials both in Washington and abroad. So we can go to our embassies and help them meet senior leaders in their country. We can do research back in DC to help them answer questions, but we can also show up to help be a specific religion expert face in the countries where they work. The second resource that we offer around the globe is what we call country consultations. We can facilitate these consultations to assist embassies in sharpening their strategic approach to assessing religious dynamics and engaging these religious actors, especially with respect to human rights, development, and conflict mitigation efforts. We establish a collaborative effort with the posts, embassies, and consuls around the world and assess what are their unanswered questions with respect to the religion dynamics in their country. And then we negotiate a research agenda and we send a team to that country to do field work to answer the questions, and then we build sort of a work plan to close the knowledge and practice gap with that embassy. And as part of the original national strategy, we went into 3 countries to sort of field test our capacity and learn best practices. And now we're offering to any American embassy around the world a custom capacity to come in and answer large questions, answer small questions, answer medium questions for them, because we have some flexibility, and now we've got a staff of about 23 people, so we actually have a global capacity to do this kind of research. In that process, we also draw from other agencies in the federal government, and we've also built relationships to external scholars who are interested in helping us in this kind of field research. And the third piece of support that we offer to embassies is helping them gauge the implementation of emerging and priority trends related to religion. And so we connect embassies to relevant experts both within the government and externally in academia. We also host and convene a number of roundtables and conversations in Washington where external religious actors or scholars can come in and we can share what's going on in terms of foreign policy that they're interested in, and they can offer their own critique and advice on those policy areas. So we have a robust network of standing religion and foreign policy working groups where we have a regular systematic interface with other civil society groups. So we solicit information from and external expertise as well, and we try to build partnerships with a robust menu of equities outside the department. So that's the internal structure. Those are some of the resources that we try to offer the wider Department of State. Let me talk now a bit about the kind of resources that we offer, the guidance we give to actual embassies around the country. While we do serve as a resource and a coordinating mechanism for the department, it's really expected that the hard work of religious engagement is actually going to be carried out by our embassies and bureaus around the world. They continue to be responsible for the vast majority of efforts to do this kind of assessment of religious dynamics and to engage religious actors on our policy priorities in the field. So we are a resource that can help them become more effective. But at the end of the day, if the United States government is going to be more effective in understanding the global political impact of religion, it's going to be because our embassies have developed that capacity, and they see it as a natural part of the diplomatic DNA. So we're there to help ramp them up and to encourage them to do this work in the field, not simply rely on us to do it exclusively from Washington, D.C. Now, as I said earlier, the good news is that many of our embassies already engage actively and constructively with this kind of religious engagement. The national strategy I mentioned a moment ago advises that posts expand and regularize such efforts, crafting an intentional strategic approach that draws on external expertise wherever appropriate. We have tried to make the case that religion is expressed in a multitude of forms by a vast array of actors, and that effective engagement is almost always determined by the geographical and political context that the embassies are located in. Therefore, engagement requires deeper understanding of the interests and equities of religious groups an assessment of the political and social implications of lived religion in the country. That is, how religion is actually practiced by adherents on the ground in specific contexts, rather than only official doctrine in sacred texts. So posts are vital in making these assessments and setting up good communication between posts in our office. It's also always important to recognize the ways in which our diplomatic work is affected by our own values and identities, and have an understanding of our own religious dynamics and how that shapes our own biases and assumptions. American trained foreign service officers are clearly going to be influenced by their own experience in terms of American religious communities, and that may not always be an asset in understanding contextually the role of faith communities in countries beyond the borders of the United States. So we've had some very specific things we've asked embassies to do as they begin to think about religious engagement in a more sophisticated way. One of the things we want them to do is to develop an institutionalized knowledge about the religious dynamics and actors in their own country. That our posts should work to cultivate and maintain a nuanced understanding of the relevant religions and their impact on policy priorities. So we make some very specific recommendations to embassies here. First, we think that there should be specific staff level accountability for matters related to religion, but also broad staff involvement. Posts and bureaus should name a point of contact for religion-related issues, but also all staff should engage on such issues, whether through regular working groups or through other information sharing tools. We commend to embassies the notion of building a religion landscape document based on their own objectives in the embassy that identifies key religious actors, charts their priorities and influences at both the national and community level, and explains relevant documents and trends, be they demographic, political, social, economic, or other. It may also be important to consider laws in the country that impact religious groups, how the host government views foreign engagement with religious actors, the various inter- and intra-religion dynamics in the country, the communal dimensions of religious identity in addition to individual choice-based ones, the relationships between religious leaders and their communities, and active religious narratives regarding both conflict and peace building. Other agencies at posts may be important partners in developing this living religious landscape document. We also think we commend to all embassies that they inform staff of training opportunities. All incoming staff ought to be oriented to the basics of this religion landscape that they take the time to build. And throughout their tenure, they should be kept aware of training opportunities related to assessing religion and working with religious actors. And finally, we asked them to report on issues related to religion and its relationship to diplomacy. One of the things the State Department does, which was something of a surprise to me, is we write cables. Our embassies write cables, which are really notes back to Washington about what's going on in their country. And the way you sort these is you have a special tag. So if you're writing a cable about a political event, there's a tag such that anybody can search for political event cables in country X. So we've now created a religion tag. So if an embassy wants to write about a religious actor or a religious event or some kind of religion dynamic, they write the cable and they send it to Washington. But it's like a keyword search that we're all very familiar with. There's now a religion tag so that my office can gather any cable written with respect to religion around the globe, and it makes us smarter about what's actually going on. And any other member of the State Department can search this vast database of cables by subject. So now if anybody's interested in religion in their country that they move to, they can now search this database for religion cables in their country. So it's a way of in a sophisticated way of distributing knowledge that is accumulating now about religion at the embassy level. So that gives you a sense of some of the embassy practices that we're commending. And currently, some embassies already do all of these things, some of them don't. So part of our mission is to make these routine and make them regularized in the DNA of all of our embassies and posts around the country. I'm going to spend a few minutes now talking about a sort of sample basket of issues that we are actually investing in, and then I think our time will be up and we'll be able to on to the conversation. So the set of issues I'm going to look at are really 6. The first one has to do with our support for the, actually I'm sorry, I've lost this one, but I can, well here it is, I'm sorry. The first issue I want to highlight for you is our support for the Palestinian-Israeli negotiations during that political period where Ambassador Martin Indyk was leading the negotiations. We were part of what Ambassador Indyk called the Global Outreach Team. It was his view that to support the principles in that tense negotiation, it was smart to build civil society support for all of the parties at that table. And so as he constructed and built the various teams under this global outreach, he thought it would be helpful if we had global outreach to the 3 faiths who were represented at those conversations. So we had people doing global Muslim outreach, global Jewish outreach, global Christian outreach, and interfaith work. And we never had that kind of religious engagement as part of our negotiating stance and process in our previous long history of trying to negotiate a long-term peaceful solution there. So we went to both faith groups in the United States that were interested in negotiations, but also in the space itself. This was perhaps the first time the State Department had systematically engaged with the religious leaders in faith communities across the 3 major faiths in that space. I'll tell you one quick anecdote. I went to see Patriarch Twall, who is the Catholic bishop in Jerusalem, and he's a towering figure there, very learned and very obviously concerned about the peace process. And I walked into his large receiving area, and interestingly enough, he had a group of Irish priest advisors. Right? I mean, why turn to the Irish? It was very interesting to me to see that's who dominated his staff. But when he came to meet me, he stuck out his hand and he said, "Dr. Casey, it is so great to see you. We've been waiting for you for 40 years." And that was a parable, I think, for why we need this office, because there are people in very sensitive, complicated parts of the world who believe we have not fully understood the religion dynamics in their country, and perhaps our diplomacy has not fully appreciated the value and equities that they bring to these complex decisions. So I absolutely laughed. That was one of the funniest things I've ever heard from a diplomat, but he nailed it. And I said, well, better late than never, and we went on and had an amazing conversation about his perspectives on what was going on in those peace negotiations. So organizing, we also organized engagement here stateside, and we did a number of interfaith convenings, which again had never actually gone on in the history of our diplomacy, trying to explain to the American cousins of the 3 faiths there in Israel what was going on in terms of the negotiations. So we had some amazing convenings of interreligious conveners or participants to talk about the peace process in a way that had never gone on. Now, we remain engaged with those religious leaders even though there's not an active peace negotiation process going on today. The second issue that we're heavily invested in is climate change. Now, it's not always self-evident to advisors or observers that climate change is a space where religious actors are very active. And I would simply say, wait for the papal encyclical that is coming out later this year, and you're going to see a very important theological statement and policy statement, I think, coming from Pope Francis. And obviously, he affords this very, very high priority. He is not alone in terms of faith groups that have a deep, deep investment and passion about mitigating and adapting to climate change. So we work at the intersection of religion and climate change in a number of ways. First of all, we promote United States policy through a number of vehicles. We've had roundtables where we brought in religious actors to talk about our policy, what we're currently doing, and what we aspire to do. We've had issue briefings where we invite faith groups to come in and hear from our climate policymakers. And we've done a number of conference phone calls where we inform anybody who wants to attend those about what's actually going on in the current policy environment. Now, you may or may not know there are at least 2 very interesting things going on now in the climate change space. President Obama announced earlier this year, actually it was late last year, he made a $3 billion pledge to what's called the Green Climate Fund, which is a global fund that will provide grants to developing countries to help mitigate and to adapt to climate change. So this will be a place where international NGOs can go, where country-specific NGOs can go, or governments, to apply for grants to deal with the implications of climate change in their countries. So President Obama made a $3 billion commitment. Over time, he's asked for a $500 million contribution in this budget cycle. And faith groups, faith-based NGOs, will be eligible to apply for these grants on a global basis. Related to that, there is a United Nations framework convention being negotiated on climate change that will, we hope, end in Paris at the end of this year, where we're hoping we'll get a global emissions reduction treaty, where presumably every, or maybe perhaps most countries of the world will make national commitments to reducing emissions. Interestingly enough, faith groups are paying very particular attention to the national commitments that are being made, not only in the United States, but globally as well. So we have been a sort of a communication conduit to these groups as we convene them. We allow our climate policy folks to educate them on how the negotiation process is going. So we've had a number of convenings where the people representing us in those negotiations have debriefed faith groups. It's been quite astonishing to me to see the amazing array of domestic and global faith groups that are invested in mitigating and adapting to global climate change. We have discovered that they're eager to come in and learn what we're doing. They want to support our policies to the extent they're able to do that. But they are united by an overlapping consensus, if you will, that we need to address this as one of the most compelling moral problems facing the globe today. The third issue I'd like to mention is that of our work in Iraq. The Office of Religion and Global Affairs plays a supporting role in our anti-ISIL campaign. We're concentrating our energy on thinking through how to promote reconciliation and religious pluralism in a post-ISIL stabilization and reconstruction phase in Iraq. Our central premise is that in order for Iraq to move forward in any kind of post-ISIL stabilization, Iraqis of all types have got to find a path to pluralism that includes reconciliation across its complex ethnic and religious diversity. Now, that road is going to be complex, but simple physical reconstruction and return of displaced people is very hard, but there is an accompanying need for reconciliation, which is going to be far, far harder. It's our belief without that reconciliation, the physical reconstruction will not last unless we address the underlying grievances that exist among multiple parties there. So we're looking a little bit over the time horizon, and we're committed to assisting Iraqis in that process, and we're finding a number of Iraqi partners on the ground to begin this conversation of what this reconciliation look like, and we can't drive it in terms of the U.S. government, but we can be a partner. And we're at this point trying to assess exactly what kind of path that means for our office. The fourth issue is that of Cuba. I assume that all of you know about the Vatican's role in helping the United States and Cuba achieve a diplomatic breakthrough. I don't need to retell that story. I assume in this context you're familiar with the basics there. Our office has a modest but I think significant diplomatic role to play in the evolving relationship and conversation between the two countries. We recently conducted a faith community roundtable at the White House with Cuba policy experts from our Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs at the State Department, the National Security Council, the Department of Treasury, and the Department of Commerce. They all had experts there to brief on the policy changes the President has announced. So this briefing outlined these regulatory changes regarding things like travel to Cuba, financial transactions that are now permissible that weren't previously, the ability of religious workers to have access to travel to Cuba, and this notion of more equipment transfers in certain categories between the United States and Cuba. So major faith-based development NGOs such as Catholic Relief Service and Church World Service came there. And you hit a home run in a briefing when you have the vice president, one of the vice presidents of Catholic Relief Service say, in hearing an answer to her question, My legal affairs department is going to be so happy to hear this news. So we were able to tell these major faith-based development agencies that indeed their work was going to be made easier because of the policy, the regulatory changes that President Obama has already announced. So we're able, I hope, in that day when we actually negotiate a new embassy successfully with Cuba, I'm hoping our staff will be able to go and show them how to engage the really interesting array of faith groups that are thriving in Cuba at this point. So there are a number of robust relationships we think are waiting to blossom and bloom. Our staff will be able to help the embassy staff meet those people, and we'll be able to help them establish those initial relationships that we think may pay dividends over the long haul, a renewed relationship with Cuba. We also, I guess the final two issues I'll talk about, and I'll stop. I realize we're getting close to the end. One of our principles is the special representative to Muslim communities. So he does work both domestically here, but primarily around the globe. And this is a tough time to have that job, as you can imagine. But he is traveling the world. He's trying to promote reconciliation. He's trying to promote Muslim-majority communities, embracing a wider array of human rights. He's trying to expand business connections and entrepreneurship. And he's trying to show how, at least in the United States, we have found a way. Muslims are a growing community, a robust community in our country, and he is engaging truly globally with an amazing array of Muslim communities. And the last piece is this notion of combating anti-Semitism that the special envoy is undertaking. As you may know, the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe today is truly a disturbing trend, and we're watching these trend lines, particularly in Europe. And Ira Foreman, our special envoy, is spending a tremendous amount of time trying to bring protection to Jewish communities, but also try to find ways to reinforce pluralism and commitment to religious toleration on what is a deeply disturbing trend line there. So let me simply stop. What I've tried to do is to show you the brief history of how this administration has become more serious and more organized in trying to engage religion as a political and diplomatic force. We have accomplished a lot in a relatively short period of time, and in this year and a half I've been there, we've gone from literally one staffer to a staff of 23. We'll probably top out somewhere around the staff of 30, which on one hand is huge by State Department standards. On another, it's a little daunting to think about a planet with 7 or 8 billion people and the incredible religious diversity and complexity around the world. But I think the good news is we at least are marginally improving our capacity to integrate religious engagement into our plans. So with that, I'll stop, and then we'll segue to the conversation.